Well, plenty to discuss with our next guest. He has more than 30 years of experience in the Canadian energy sector, including time as a former top executive at what is now TC Energy. Dennis McConaghy is the author of multiple books on Canada's energy debate and energy future. His most recent is Carbon Change, Canada on the Brink of Decarbonization. Dennis McConaghy, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Rob.
Like I say, lots to talk about. It was interesting this week at the Global Energy Show in Calgary here. You had the Secretary General of OPEC talking about energy demand, oil demand continuing to rise, maybe well into 2050 perhaps even. So as we talk about where things are going in Canada, what's your sense of overall demand trends here?
Well, I really have just 2 points to make about that. And of course, what the OPEC official was putting out publicly is something that I think many of us have believed was actually going to be the case. And there's really two reasons. The affordability of hydrocarbons still outweighs other energy options. Secondly, it's very difficult to actually substitute certain applications that hydrocarbons have. Um, that really erode this fundamental world global demand for hydrocarbons. And people in North America tend to think about the indispensability of hydrocarbons for air travel, plastics, in some applications related to personal transportation. Yet in other parts of the world, something as fundamental as still using coal to provide basic heat, process heat, is still part of what is driving this demand. So, I mean, it's a function of its indispensability, and secondly, its affordability. And that latter point, I think, has been more demonstrated, especially across the developed economies over the last 5 years, where people were coming out of events like not just Paris, but the Glasgow conference, that we were really committed to decarbonization. But lo and behold, the world evidences that it can't actually afford it. And moreover, as Spain just illustrated, there are risks, substantial risks, to trying to electrify an economy based on a market share or a supply share for renewables that gets too high, and that you have moments where the basic integrity of your electricity grid is put into question unless you have sufficient backup in the form of natural gas generation. So in total, none of this should be surprising, and it creates a very special dilemma for this country of Canada, given especially who is currently the Prime Minister.
Right, and we are at a bit of a moment in time here because this is a government, and some of this Mark Carney has inherited the more aggressive sort of net zero targets, but at the same time, there's a need to meet demand. There's conversations now about possible new pipelines. So, what's your sense of which way the government is leaning here?
Well, first of all, Mark Carney, independent of what he inherited, has had a long history of being committed to the notion of net zero. He was a special UN envoy to try to advance the idea that the financial community would stop lending to hydrocarbon companies across the globe as part of an effort to advance this energy transition. So unlike the former prime minister, who was hardly steeped in an academic or scientific background, Carney comes to this certainly from the interface between the financial world and the efforts to try to advance decarbonization. And so this is a personal conviction for him as much as it is an inherited policy. So and of course, Mark Carney is a man of legitimate credentials. So he's actually a more formidable, I'll put it, a more formidable adversary for the interests of Alberta. And let me just make this point. It's not so much how does Canada meet its own energy demands as it is, does Canada fully capture the export opportunity that is represented by hydrocarbons? And this really comes down to two places. and they all are at odds with some of the fundamental intentions of his government. So what are we talking about? In the case of oil, Canada, I think, still has, and when you say Canada in oil, you're really talking almost exclusively about Alberta. we have the ability to expand existing oil production up potentially over the next 10 years, I'm confident, towards another million barrels a day. That's on top of the 5 million that we are already producing. So how does that 5 million break down? 4 million of it is oil sands production. The last other 1 million is our residual conventional production. To be able to add another million barrels to that would be a significant contribution to a country that has just spent the last 10 years with zero GDP growth, largely because of its unwillingness to fully embrace the infrastructure required to accelerate Canadian oil production. So on the table is a real simple economic choice. Is Canada going to fully commit itself to that export opportunity in the context of a world that cannot do without these hydrocarbons, and in the context of a world that if we don't choose to capture these markets for our heavy oil, other countries will, and they will do with no regard for the kind of climate policy that Mark Carney, I think, still intends to impose in Alberta. So let's be really specific on the oil side. Three things would have to that are on the table, and possibly a fourth one. The first is, of course, the issue of emissions caps and how those could ever be met without contracting production. Number two is the existence of this federal statute known as the Impact Assessment Act, which is basically the statute that you would have to use in order to get any new infrastructure, a new oil pipeline, built, and the significant risks that statute represents to any private sector capital that would want to advance such a project. And then thirdly is the West Coast tanker moratorium, a moratorium that would apply as much to Kitimat as it would to Prince Rupert. And then you can add a fourth one, which is, Carney's most recent invocation is this idea that I'm okay with a new pipeline for oil as long as the oil is decarbonized. And of course, that actually means, on its face perhaps, that Alberta would have to contemplate applying carbon capture and sequestration technology, CCS technology, to all of the related emissions of its oil sands production, a technology that in my mind is approaching like a $300 a ton carbon tax on that production, and still expecting Alberta and Canada to actually be competitive in world markets. It is another way of actually saying that we don't want to, as a government, we don't want this growth in the Alberta oil sands. In fact, we want it going in the other direction because it's antithetical to the whole notion of net zero. So all this, so that's just on the oil side. On the gas side, of course, again, it is an issue of LNG. The place where Alberta and Canada, and it's a more national thing in respect of natural gas because there are significant parts of Canada's shale oil or shale gas endowment that exists in Northeast BC. So the opportunity is kind of there for this country. Are we going to build on the one world scale facility that is in place at Kitimat, the LNG Canada facility that's led by Shell, Asian partners, DC Energy being the entity that has built the pipeline that has basically connected to from the Alberta gathering system all the way to the port of Kitimat? Does Canada build on that opportunity? Does it actually then take on potentially the idea of another gas LNG world scale project, either in the same right of way to Kitimat or potentially try to use Prince Rupert as the port? And there are distinctions between the two. Prince Rupert is probably harder to get to as a pipelining proposition, but it is open to the Pacific Ocean. Unlike Kitimat, which we've already found a way to get across the coastal gas or the coastal mountains, you get into Kitimat, but you still have significant more work to do to manage the channels into Kitimat that make it, a more, I'll just say, more challenging marine exercise of getting the tankers to Kitimat as compared to Prince Rupert. But those are the relative issues between the two. Regardless, there is an LNG opportunity for Canada in a world that increasingly wants to consume more natural gas, needs to do this for not just maintaining the integrity of existing electrical systems, but the basic potential for substituting some of that higher emissive coal for natural gas. So again, Canada has that opportunity, but it faces the same two of the three problems: emission caps and the perverse effects of that federal regulatory statute. And you can actually add the same decarbonizing constraint, because when you make LNG, you produce more natural gas. So there are some incremental emissions related to the production and transmission of the natural gas. And then when you get to the LNG step, you do have to compress the gas into the liquid phase. That requires energy, that almost always requires burning natural gas to create that energy. So again, it's a real simple choice for Mark Carney. Am I going to have am I going to have conflict and collision with Alberta, an Alberta led by Danielle Smith, on whether Alberta will be basically allowed by the federal government to fully develop this hydrocarbon opportunity versus um, trying to impose conditions that doesn't have that happen, and then still believe that there's other sources of the Canadian economy that can actually realistically grow to replace what could have been provided by the hydrocarbon sector. All of which is in the context of a still unresolved trade situation with Donald Trump, where one can expect, I think, if that continues to be difficult and it actually translates into higher levels of unemployment in central Canada, there will be even more tensions as to how Alberta will be expected to help cover the cost of whatever actions are taken by the federal government to like see people through this crisis, on whether or not Canada comes out with an auto industry after Donald Trump sets his demands in place, or does it all break down because the cost to the United States citizens become unbearable and he has to pull back. But the point being made is there is a set of issues related to trade that Carney is going to want to mitigate. He needs money to do that, and where's he going to look to get it from? And it's doubly ironic if he's unwilling to let Alberta expand its hydrocarbon production. So I think, to me, this is the fundamental question that we're all really confronting, I think, as Albertans and as Canadians. But it's more acute here because, at the one hand, if Carney imposes net zero, well, that means, for all intents and purposes, we stop producing hydrocarbons, which is like untenable for Alberta to accept. On the other hand, from a Carney point of view, if I allow Alberta to develop these resources, then the idea of net zero is really even more impossible than it was to begin with, because this is all a game, really, I think, from his point of view. What are we credibly doing that still advances that notion versus actually doing a fundamental reversal of policy?
Mhm. Well, how much do timelines matter? I mean, the Alberta government has talked about net zero targets looking to 2050 or beyond. So, I mean, if we're going to pursue it, does it make a difference in terms of how quickly we mandate it, how we go about doing so?
Well, first of all, it makes no sense for Canada to be committed to net zero unless the other developed economies of the world are equally committed. And we know one economy is utterly indifferent to it, the one that matters the most, actually,
Mhm.
in the United States. And I say that because, regardless of however this trade dispute plays out, Canadian US economic integration is never going to be fundamentally unwound, regardless of how frayed this gets. Having said that, um, 2050, in terms of whether net zero is still on the table, remains to be seen. There will be this collision between those who still see affordable energy as fundamental to the economic growth and the economic stability and political stability of really the world order, versus those who insist that growing emissions are inexorably leading to higher levels of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, which will lead to various manifestations of climate caused natural disaster, and no amount of adaptation can kind of mitigate that. However, at the moment, people are marching with their feet. Oil demand is not going down. The ability to impose net zero mandates has proven to be very difficult. Um, you can do, people can examine all the equivocations that Germany has now had, even in England, with a climate minister as even more, as I'll put it, just as committed to net zero as people like Gibault are in Canada. Even they have had to um, recognize that there are fundamental energy affordability issues in that country that they have to work around. And also, if they're going to have any chance of advancing it, England will have to rediscover nuclear energy because there are limitations to what renewables can provide, while at the same time still coming to terms with what their energy circumstances could be benefited by if they were to allow shale gas development within that country. So, I mean, there's tensions everywhere, but they all come back to the world is finding it increasingly difficult to get off hydrocarbons because they are fundamentally affordable and reliable. So the question for Canada is, do we just eschew this opportunity, or do we actually take the view that we are going to meet this market demand in a world where the people that we compete with and the markets we sell to are making no tangible movements towards net zero? So why would we indulge in this sort of economic self-destruction? And to me, that's really the point that as things play out, Danielle Smith has to make to Albertans and to Canadians and confront Carney.
It's interesting because, as you say, I mean, we're talking about opportunities that exist in both oil and natural gas. Now, Mark Carney, it was interesting because he seems reluctant to push ahead with any kind of project that might have some provincial opposition, and that might include BC and say Northern Gateway or something like Northern Gateway. Whereas on LNG, I mean, BC is much more bullish, supportive of LNG. They've got their own resources to develop, as you say. We've got LNG Canada, there's Cedar LNG, Wood Fiber LNG. Should we be a little more optimistic about the prospect of LNG development, and where does that leave oil, do you think?
Well, oil is more valuable. Oil is more immediate,
Mhm.
because if we were to simply, as a matter of national commitment, and I'll tell you what that would really mean, which is that the Prime Minister of Canada would say, yes, I will do everything to ensure that a Northern Gateway 2.0 is revived. Now, I understand that, the Premier is musing about Prince Rupert. My own view is going to Kitimat would make more sense. That, of course, confronts the Trudeau butts moratorium. Uh, Obviously, Carney is, I think, basically trying to resist that. And it's really by creating these conditions that make it impossible for it to be realized, without overtly saying I'm opposed to any expansion of Alberta's oil industry, let alone I really want it contracted. On the case of natural gas, it is somewhat, quote, easier, but the fact of the matter still remains, if Canada were to add 1, 2, or 3 world scale LNG facilities on the West Coast, we would have incremental emissions. And, Carney would have to accept that. And there would be resistance from uh, not just the other elements of his coalition, but he himself as to how he would rationalize that. But I concede, natural gas is an easier, it has somewhat less resistance, but it may not. But at the end of the day, it will still be very difficult. But moreover, there's more value in oil, and there's more immediacy to actually gain from building, what I would just call Northern Gateway 2.0, and then allowing the industry to add that extra million barrels and fill that pipe up. And it gives optionality, um, both to Asia and existing American markets. And people should appreciate this is heavy oil. Most of it is going to go into refineries uniquely designed to run on that kind of oil. And at the moment, Canada has a major, I mean, people should just always be conscious. Canada is like number 4 in the world in terms of oil production.
Yeah.
Adding another million barrels makes us even more elemental to and fundamental to the world oil supply. So, I mean, this is a real, I mean, it's an overused word, but this is a real existential choice for this country.
So, what do you make then of this legislation that the Carney government has tabled? The idea of identifying projects that would be in the national interest, having a time frame, an ideal time frame of 2 years to get that approved. We've seen how long it takes to get pipelines approved and built in this country, but still, as you say, with some of the conditions around decarbonization, are you more optimistic now, maybe than you were in previous years, that we could see another pipeline built?
Some of us actually participated in the whole consultation process related to how that bill was originally
Mhm.
put in place. So we're talking about the Impact Assessment Act, and Carney's legislation would provide some amendments. And in fact, the industry itself has, collectively sent letters before the election and has reiterated the positions. They want some fundamental change in that statute. Let me just make this point. Regardless of what the statute says, nothing is more important than actually trusting the federal government that it is committed to a project. And you can write whatever legislation you want, but if the federal government is at the end of the day equivocal or even fundamentally opposed to incremental oil being produced in Canada, there's no statute is going to solve that problem. So yes, it is constructive, absolutely constructive, if you can get a definitive permit to do this project within 2 years after you've actually made the application. But people should remember, the private sector has to decide, do I want to take this risk on? Then they have to assemble like the application, and then the clock starts. So, you're talking really about 4 years more than 2 to actually start this. And then you've got construction. All this would be accelerated if Carney would simply unequivocally say, we are committed to this national project. National, which then does imply that no one specific province has a veto on whether this project can go ahead or not, regardless of how the economic rents from that project are distributed between Alberta and other provinces. Now, in the case of natural gas, again, as you pointed out, BC enjoys as many of those rents as does Alberta through, natural gas production, which they are the major royalty collector. But having said that, I mean, yes, those are constructive amendments, Dave. But again, the issue for private capital will be, can I trust Mark Carney? Is he really committed to this? And can Danielle Smith trust him?
Yeah, there is. We talked about Donald Trump and the Trump factor in all of this. Certainly, he seems to want to see increased production in the U.S. At the same time, I think he wants to see lower prices, and maybe that could be somewhat at odds. But the question of Canadian imports to the U.S. This was the same president who approved Keystone XL. Now seems to say he doesn't want Canadian oil. So, how does all of that factor in?
Well, just make 2 points. Um, the American refining industry knows the value of Canadian heavy oil.
Right.
That industry collectively, I think, did have impact on the fact that when Trump was applying tariffs on Canada, tariffs on Alberta oil were at 10%. Tariffs on Alberta and BC natural gas were at 10%. Now, they may today be zero in the interim until they have to come to the next deadline on whether they are exempted because of the USMCA. But the point is, there was a recognition that the adjustments that Donald Trump wants out of Canada do not relate to energy. In fact, the integration of continental energy, I think, is something that he is not fundamentally at odds with. Because in fact, that say we do produce this extra million barrels and someone was to then put into play, well, instead of building the pipe to the West Coast and dealing with all the environmental risks of the Douglas Channel, let's just revive KXL and send it all to the Gulf Coast. I mean, that is more difficult in such an environment where his actions related to other significant portions of the Canadian economy. And make no mistake, I think he does have an agenda that at its most brutal, is pointed at the continuance of a Canadian auto industry. Because I think he is obviously he has never claimed issues with uh, Saskatchewan potash, Quebec hydroelectric, or Alberta oil. So, I mean, Trump is a problem in terms of an overall trade situation that should never have been provoked, uh, but it got Carney elected, and he is the human being that basically is leading this country that Alberta has to deal with.
Should we? I mean, if it was on the table, if Keystone XL was back on the table, though, is that something Canada should say yes to still?
Well, first of all, I come from this proposition. Whether we're talking about Northern Gateway 2.0 or revived KXL or some other oil-related export project, although in my own mind, I dismiss any revivals of Energy East. That should be, in the first instance, determined by private capital. Which of those options does private capital believe provides the greatest economy, coupled with which has the least, quote, regulatory and political risk? Well, at the moment, both of them are dead in the water if you're really serious about net zero. But assuming you're open to that possibility, my first test is which of those two projects would attract private sector support. And I mean, it would be true that if the Northern Gateway option did acquire that private sector support, and what that really means is, are the oil sands producers willing to financially commit to new pipeline infrastructure and allow entities like DC, like South Bow or Enbridge or other entities that can be assembled to do this kind of a project? Would they value the economics to be better one relative to the other, and would they believe that they could actually get a commitment from this federal government that they are prepared to back it? Now, just in respect of KXL, KXL is less disruptive to Canada because we basically had the permits in hand for that section. So there's a relatively less environmental impact in just the physics of building the pipe. However, you have the same incremental emissions that you'd have to get over whether it goes to Asia or the US, and it implies more economic integration with the US. So again, the federal government might have a real preference for diversification. In fact, that was one of Carney's 4 positions. He phrased it rather obliquely, referring to autonomy and robustness, I think. But my own view is, which of those two would garner private sector support? I would tend to follow the lead, whichever that was the case. My own sense is where it is more likely to be in the form of a West Coast oil pipeline as the next increment, not a revival of KXL. That would be my own intuition today.
Yeah. Well, we'll see where this all goes. Some big decisions that we have to make as a country for sure. Dennis McConaghy, appreciate the conversation and the insight on all of this. Thanks again for making some time for us here.
Thank you, Rob.